Do you prefer to be seen with a veil or without one?
I prefer without it.
In other countries, girls of your age would be out dancing at night with their boyfriends. Do you feel you're leading a very dull, unexciting life?
No, I prefer our society, and I like to dance also.
Really, I think that we are accomplishing a revolution here. We're accomplishing it over 10 years instead of in the early morning of the daytime.
His Majesty King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, by common consent, the wisest and the shrewdest of all the 48 sons of King Abdulaziz, the founder of the kingdom. King Faisal, a desert warrior at 13, is now in his early 60s. He prays 5 times a day, and he lives strictly according to the Muslim code. He doesn't drink or smoke, and he lives modestly. Whereas his brother, ex-King Saud, whom he deposed in 1964, is alleged to have had more than 360 wives and concubines, King Faisal has only one wife. He was convinced that economic chaos and an Egyptian-inspired coup would be almost inevitable if King Saud was allowed to continue his reckless rule. King Saud, Faisal thought, was playing right into Nasser's hands. Faisal was convinced that the only way to keep Nasser at bay was to implement a crash program of economic and social reform. On the surface, there is no doubt that King Faisal is making great progress. One difficulty is the sheer size of his desert kingdom. It's spread over an area roughly 10 times the size of Britain, but its population is less than half of London's. The fantastic pace at which new modern roads are eating into the desert has earned Saudi Arabia the title of the fastest developing country in the world. Unlike most developing countries, Saudi Arabia, because of her vast oil wealth, is not short of money. But the rate at which it's being poured out to finance new roads is so great that the king's accountants have difficulty in keeping up to date with the cost of it all. In 1957, the total budget for the development of all forms of communications was £9 million. Last year, nearly 70 million was spent on development projects, most of them roads. The boom in Saudi Arabia's economy is suitably reflected in the glow of the government's administrative headquarters in Riyadh. The ministry buildings are elegant and expensive. From them, the orders go out for the spending of more millions on social welfare schemes, on the development of trade and industry, and on defense. Saudi Arabia recently concluded a £100 million defense deal with Britain, which includes the supply of 40 Lightning fighters. These pictures of a vampire graveyard at Jeddah airport help to illustrate just how badly Saudi Arabia needs a new defense system. These vampires, brought several years ago from Britain, have remained rotting and rooted to the spot where they were left by the British pilots who delivered them. No Saudi pilots have been capable of flying them. As the guardian of the holy places of Islam, for which Mecca, the holy city forbidden to all but Muslims, is the spiritual capital, Saudi Arabia is spending more than £50 million on enlarging the 2 great mosques. The religion's holiest shrine is the Kaaba, the cubical building to which Muslims throughout the world turn when they prostrate themselves in prayer. Ironically, Islam's holy book, the Quran, is the source of the greatest obstacle to social revolution. For the Quran is the basis of Saudi Arabia's constitutional laws as well as its religion. By their insistence on the strictest interpretation of the Quranic laws, the country's religious leaders have succeeded in the past in shackling material progress. The need for a new interpretation of the Quran is demonstrated by Saudi Arabia's methods, based mostly on the Quran, of punishing crime. The application of Saudi justice is based on 2 main principles.
There is a specific punishment for every crime, and every punishment, including executions, are carried out in public. And by Western standards, some of the punishments for some of the crimes seem little less than barbaric. On this beach in Jeddah this morning, I witnessed a thief having his hand chopped off. This is the specified punishment for stealing. While the royal proclamation was read and while the ritual itself was carried out, our cameras were temporarily confiscated. By the time they were returned to us, most of the crowd of thousands who turned out to watch had dispersed. Those still on the scene were waiting to catch a glimpse of the spot where the mutilated hand was burned in a fire. Adultery is punished by death. Female adulterers are stoned to death. Male adulterers are thrown from the top of the highest building. Murder is punished by death, and the common practice is still for the guilty party to be beheaded. The last execution of that kind was in January this year.
The most prolific of all of Saudi Arabia's executioners is the man on the left. His name is Eid. Eid doesn't know how old he is, but he does know how many heads he's chopped off. It's a total of 108. The success of King Faisal's plans to spread reform throughout his country, 1 million square miles of desert, depends as much on the willingness of his people to accept changes as on the willingness of the religious leaders to agree to changes. A third of Saudi Arabia's estimated population of about 5 million is made up by nomads, tribesmen who still live much the same as they did in biblical times. The nomads and the tent-dwelling Bedouin do not want to be drawn into the 20th century. King Faisal, who is keenly aware that he must not go too fast for them, admits that he does not know the answer himself, but he is prepared to gamble because he must. But King Faisal's greatest gamble perhaps is in the towns, where the city slicker's status symbol is an American car. American not because they're better, cheaper, or more reliable than their British and continental rivals, but American because they're the biggest and the showiest. They also have the loudest horns. The danger for King Faisal here is that by speeding the reforms, he may hasten the revolution. The affluent city slickers, having tasted and liked some of the 20th century's virtues, may now want some of its vices. The slow but gradual emancipation of Saudi women is said to have started in 1960, when the government took what was at the time a huge decision in allowing pictures of women to be published. Censorship of printed material is confined now mostly to news reports, and the targets for the censor's careless razor blade are invariably foreign reports about Saudi Arabia. Israel and President Nasser never make news either. We found the most remarkable proof of the pace of Saudi Arabia's social revolution behind these walls. This is the Dar el Hanan School for Girls in Jeddah. The name means House of Affection. These are almost certainly the first ever pictures taken in Saudi Arabia of young Saudi women unveiled. The fact that the headmistress and the girls, with the approval of their parents, had allowed us to take this film of them was at first disbelieved by some astonished government officials. Some people expressed fears that there would be big trouble, perhaps even a riot, if word of what we'd done reached the ears of the religious leaders and some of the less enlightened parents. The opening of the first girls' school in Saudi Arabia had to be postponed for 2 years because of opposition to it. Then, when it was opened 5 years ago, the government had to send in troops and police to keep it open. Protesting parents wrecked the school and beat up teachers. At another girls' school in Saudi Arabia today, the only man at the school is a priest, and he's allowed in only because he's blind. After we'd filmed some of the girls, I was allowed to talk to 2 of them. Can I ask you, first of all, what do you want to do when you're qualified, when you leave the school perhaps and go to university?
I want to go to the university in any country I can go.
And what about you?
I'm going to America. I want to be a social worker.
When you're qualified, do you want to come back to Saudi Arabia?
Of course, yes.
How do you feel about talking to us without your veil? Do you prefer to be seen with a veil or without one?
No, I prefer without.
And how about you?
I prefer without it.
Why do you think you've been made to wear a veil?
It is Islam custom.
It's traditions of our country, but I prefer without it.
When, in other countries, in England, in America and Canada and countries like that, girls of your age would be out dancing at night with their boyfriends and all that sort of thing, going to parties.
Yes.
Now, you're not allowed by your religion to do this. Do you feel you're leading a very dull, unexciting life?
No, I prefer our society, and I like to dance also, but like the others do.
You don't think that you have a dull life compared with girls
No.
in other countries?
No.
The headmistress of this enlightened school, perhaps ironically, is an Egyptian. She insists that the girls remove their veils the moment they set foot inside the school walls.
For one reason, it's much more practical for girls to move around without their veils on. Then we don't have any men teachers, and all the supervisors are women. If they're supposed to veil, they're supposed to veil from men. So there's no reason why they should put the veils on if all the people in charge of the girls inside school are women.
When they leave school each day, the girls have to put their veils back on. We may have been allowed to gaze upon them in the flesh, but in some of their homes, even their fathers and brothers are not yet allowed to do that. The TV mast is probably the most prominent symbol of King Faisal's determination to lead his country into the 20th century. But this project too had near disastrous labor pains. The religious leaders agreed to the introduction of television on the condition that women should be shown only in subordinate roles to men. All went comparatively smoothly until the first night a woman appeared on the screen. Hours later, the television station, like the school before it, was wrecked. The ringleaders of the riot were beheaded. The most graphic recent example of the sort of religious bigotry King Faisal is fighting came to light last January when the vice president of the Islamic University in Medina insisted that the earth was in a fixed position and did not rotate. Anyone who professed otherwise, he said, would utter infidelity and deviation, because such an act is a charge of falsehood toward God, the Quran, and the Prophet. Throughout Saudi Arabia, nothing but Muslim religious institutions are allowed to function. Yet, religious police still stalk the streets with their canes to make sure that everyone goes to the mosques to pray. Shopkeepers who do not close down when the religious police pass by with their shouts of Salah, Salah, pray, pray, are liable to be carted off to jail and flogged. But I found evidence to suggest that a European can always slip under half-drawn shutters and find a shopkeeper ready to serve mammon instead of God. The bright neon lights that wink so provocatively in the night are so misleading they are almost an hallucination. Although there is said to be a rapidly rising demand from Saudis for black market whiskey and gin at £8 a bottle, alcoholic drinks are absolutely prohibited, even to foreign diplomats. There are also no official public cinemas and no dance halls, and such things as nightclubs and casinos are still regarded as immoral. For most Saudi town dwellers, the only 20th century relief from the gloom of Arabian nights is television. But television is controlled by the government and censorship is severe. So severe that one night, several weeks ago, Saudi viewers were denied the fun of seeing Mickey Mouse being rewarded with a kiss from his wife, Minnie Mouse. The censor scissors fell just before their lips met. As more and more Saudis make contact with the outside world, will they be content to go on accepting the old ideas, or will they insist on transplanting new ones, direct from London, Paris, New York and Beirut? But for an economic miracle in 1938, there could have been no revolutions of any sort in Saudi Arabia. The miracle, of course, was oil, black gold. Oil royalties are now gushing into Saudi Arabia's coffers at the rate of just over £200 million a year. The giant oil refinery of the Arabian American Oil Company at Ras Tanura on the Persian Gulf is now producing over 200 million barrels of crude oil every day. In the league table of the world's largest oil producers, Saudi Arabia has moved up to 5th position. If President Nasser's long-term aim really is to dominate South Arabia with a view then to asserting at least his political influence in Saudi Arabia, it's generally agreed that his prime objective must be to get his hands on Saudi Arabia's oil. When King Faisal and President Nasser met last August to sign the Yemen peace treaty, they kissed and shook hands. The question now, of colossal importance to the West, especially Britain, is whether the two men can ever again resolve their differences with a shake of their hands. If they can't, there seems no alternative to war. I began my interview with King Faisal by asking him if he thought the removal of the British military presence from Aden would make the chances for peace in the Middle East better or worse.
What we would really like is for Southern Arabia to get its full independence. As for the problems of keeping peace and stability in Southern Arabia, these can be solved only by the people themselves. We are glad to know that they will be getting independence, which we have called for on their behalf several times. But they must use that independence wisely, because the first duty it imposes upon them is to keep their national unity and to agree among themselves what is in the interest of their country.
In an interview that lasted 40 minutes and contained 20 questions, the only committed statement he made was this: "I do not know what is in Nasser's mind." Much less cautious is Prince Mohammed, who reflects publicly, many people think, what his father, the king, feels privately.
So we can see what is happening in Egypt, we can see what is happening in Saudi Arabia and other areas which are following similar lines. In Egypt, the economic situation is very bad. There is a lot of adventurism in the development program. Sometimes they do things on the spur of the moment. But when you take the overall, you find that we are going at a much faster rate, really. And really, I think that we are accomplishing a revolution here. We're accomplishing it over 10 years instead of over in the early morning of the daytime.
The philosophies represented by Egypt on the one hand and Saudi Arabia on the other seem to be in total opposition, and it seems to some people that a head-on clash is perhaps unavoidable.
There is always that possibility. I don't like to say that we will resort to force, but and I don't like to say that Egypt is going to resort to force, because I think we both have a lot to lose in this.
Do you think there is any undue significance to be attached to the recent visit to Cairo of the Russian Prime Minister, Mr. Kosygin? Do you think it means perhaps that the Russians are preparing for another initiative to penetrate into the Middle East?
I think they have succeeded in recent years in penetrating the Middle East. The new visit of Mr. Kosygin to the area was, I think, trying to consolidate this penetration.
Do you think part of what you call this consolidation process is in preparation for the Russians to attempt to get their hands on the oil here?
I think that's one of their objectives. Another objective is the warm water ports that they need, which has been a constant ambition of Russia, and this definitely, I think they will try hard to go and get it.
All in all, the signs would appear to point to a very crucial 5 years for the Middle East now.
I would say so, and I would like to point something else, is that the dangers of surrounding the Middle East area here are not just from Russia. There are many other dangers which we have to be prepared for too. But certainly the most serious and the most potentially successful is the Russian penetration of the Middle East area.
The economic and social revolution that is taking place in Saudi Arabia is geared almost exclusively to the person of the king himself. You think then that it's absolutely essential for King Faisal to be in charge of things for the next 5 years?
I think it is very, very important and very essential to have him stay here. I would like him to stay much longer.
In the children's song, a popular one in schools throughout the country, a prayer for King Faisal.